Welcome back to the Pirate Republic. This is an audiobook presentation of Pirates of the Wild West, the first novel in the Storm of Time series, released one chapter at a time. If you're enjoying this show and would like to support the podcast, you can do so on Patreon at the Pirate Republic. Physical copies of the book are available on Amazon and through traditional bookstores. Signed copies can be found on my website, briancantrell.com. In the previous chapter, the greatest pirates of the age were torn from Nassau Harbor by a storm unlike ever recorded. In this chapter, they awakened to those consequences. What dragged them from their world has not finished with them yet. This is Chapter 2, The Emergence. Chapter 2, The Emergence. San Francisco Harbor, 1873. Charlotte de Berry's wide eyes blinked rapidly in the dark salt water that filled the ship's cargo hold. She was holding back panic as she swam along the ceiling looking for an air pocket to give relief to her oxygen-starved lungs. Her last breath was a distant memory now, as was her mind's image of the cargo hold since the torrent of water rushed in to fill the room from a hole created by an untethered 8-foot cannon barrel that sailed across the room to crash completely through the side of the ship. She was using that fading image of the room to navigate herself back to the entrance in the pitch-black water. She turned and moved her braided hair to see the dimmest rays of light that were coming from the stairwell now. Charlotte kicked her feet off a beam to propel herself toward that welcoming sight. Her mind pushed back the fleeting thoughts and confusion of how she found herself in this horrifying predicament. Images flashed in her head of the enormous whirlpool that swallowed the Queen Anne's Revenge. The entire 200-ton ship was sucked into its gaping mouth like an ant caught in a drainpipe. The storm, with its hurricane-force winds, had brought forth the ghastliest sea that had ever been seen. Her brethren pirates were tossed and slammed about the ship's deck, some propelled over the side as if the tentacles of a kraken yanked them over. Edward Thatch, in all his fiendish glory, faced the brunt of the storm, hands gripped tightly to the wheel with a maniacal grin on his bearded face. He had steered the ship up that wave of ungodly proportions, which seemed an impossible feat, bringing the hull fully out of the water and into the starless sky as it crested, only to plunge down faster than a raging tiger toward the bottomless depths of the churning sea. She remembered diving down the stairwell of the hold to escape being thrown from the drowning ship, which in retrospect was a foolish idea now that she was trapped in the flooded, dark compartment. A clamorous sound reverberated through the vessel, audible even in the water, as it suddenly twisted, and what seemed like up became down. Charlotte, lungs burning, scraped and clawed along the floor as her buoyancy flipped and the light faded away. She fought against all urges to breathe in the cold, salty ocean as she reached the stairwell. Working her arms and legs, she desperately traversed out of the stairwell, finally reaching the deck of the drowned ship. She achingly searched for the surface of the water and felt the force of the ship pressing down against her. She was about to let out a watery scream in frustration as she realized the ship was sinking upside down with her underneath it, when suddenly the Queen Anne's Revenge let out a thunderous groan and once again rolled, righting itself. Suddenly, the bow of the ship pointed toward the surface like a hand desperately reaching out for a hold. Charlotte's eyes could see the dim light of the surface becoming brighter as her lungs reached their limit and began to take in the briny, cold water. Mary Read had no time to shiver despite being plunged into the freezing water as she struggled to stay afloat. She was now regretting the years she spent at sea, never learning how to swim. Cold and fatigue were taking its toll on her legs and arms as she looked around at the bits of flotsam surrounding her. Her eyes searched desperately for something to hang on to, something large enough that would float and carry her weight. A few yards away, the vacant eyes of the drowned Palsgrave Williams, first mate of Sam Bellamy, panicked her heart. Her head went under for the 5th time, and she kicked and churned to rise again. Spitting water and sucking in air, her face crested the water's surface. She saw at that moment Jack Rackham clutching a large floating piece of yardarm. She called out to him, screamed in fact, for his help. He clung tightly with both arms wrapped around the safety of the wide cut of wood. His eyes full of fear, he turned his head away from her. Coward, she thought. Pretty to look at, but with the backbone of a jellyfish. This was it, she thought. Here was her end. Doomed to drown in the sea in which she sought to command, only yards away from a helping hand that was selfishly gripping the only floating thing large enough to support a woman's weight. Mary's strength waned, and she dropped under again. She made less of an effort this time to surface, giving up and letting her body sink as the gentle pull of the water enveloped her. She looked down beneath her feet into the dark sea. She could barely make out the brown ocean floor rising to meet her. My mind must be going, she thought. She was the one sinking, not the sandy floor rising. Air bubbles began to surround her as she watched the incredible sight of the Queen Anne's Revenge ascending to the surface underneath her. The wide deck was rapidly surging up from below her feet. She made a determined effort to kick her feet and swim her arms to match the speed of its ascent. The ship reached her, picked her up, and pressed her body to the deck of the bow as it raced to the surface. The Queen Anne's Revenge broke through the water and into the night air, rising 5 yards out of the cold sea before settling down, listing starboard. The 15-degree list caused Charlotte de Barry's body to roll several times until she slammed into the rail. That impact is what most likely saved her life. The thrust of her body hitting the rail against her back caused her chest to convulse and expel the seawater from her lungs. She violently coughed and spit, gasping for breath. It took a moment, but she realized someone was holding her and slapping her on the back. A woman's voice, she thought as her head cleared. She turned her tear-filled eyes to see the smiling, soggy, wretched face of Mary Reed. Mary had a gash on her forehead that leaked blood over one side of her face. Her wavy red hair was darkened by the water and clung in wild mats against her face. "You can stop slapping me, you ghoul," Charlotte managed to choke. Mary Reed helped Charlotte sit up and then slouched down next to her. "You're welcome," she retorted. "Next time we drown, I'll not help you if that's how you say thanks." Charlotte looked over at Mary and then used her hands to wipe the blood from Mary's face. "Coming back from the dead to first see your bloody face could make a girl die again from fright," she said. The two women looked on, exhausted, as several other figures began to rise and cough water out of their lungs. "To hell with you, Poseidon!" the booming voice of Edward Thatch called out as his broad, panther-like frame rose from the deck of the aft castle. There were a few laughs as the throng of water-drenched pirates gathered themselves from the chaos. Thatch, followed by Black Caesar and Henry Jennings, climbed down onto the main deck. Emerging around them were Bart Roberts, Sam Bellamy, Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, and Anne Bonny. All differences were set aside as they patted each other's backs and laughed off the danger they had all faced. Mary helped Charlotte to her feet, and they joined the remaining crew. "Is this the lot of us?" asked Hornigold as he gazed around the deserted deck. "I saw many drown and go over the side," Black Caesar commented. Anne looked fearfully at Black Caesar. "Jack? Did you see him? Did the sea take him?" "Aye, your husband James as well," Black Caesar told Anne, whose face flushed as she'd given no thought to what happened to James. Palsgrave, Stede Bonnet, others, all swept away. The pirates looked around at one another, taking stock of the remnants of their crew. 10, just 10 survivors. The sea did in one night what England, France, and Spain could not, said Jennings, shaking his head. "Help!" came a distant cry to their ears. "Jack!" exclaimed Anne. She ran to the side, peering off into the night, searching for the source of the voice. The rest of the pirates lined the railing, leaning out over the water, looking for Jack Rackham. "There!" Vane pointed. Jack was clinging to the broken yardarm with his hand reaching out just below them. His long, black, water-soaked hair hung over his face. "You look like a drowned cat, Rackham," Thatch laughed. "Throw me a damned rope! This water is freezing!" Rackham yelled desperately. Black Caesar tossed down a rope, and he, Hornigold, and Sam Bellamy hauled up Rackham, shivering and soaked to the bone. Anne threw her arms around him and held him close as Rackham's teeth chattered. "I thought I lost you, love," Anne said through tears. "Nothing could keep your Jack away. Not even the worst hurricane the Caribbean has ever seen," Jack told her. "I don't know what makes me want to retch more, the seawater in my belly or listening to these two," said Thatch. "I'd drink a barrel of ocean water if given that choice," said Charlotte. This made the crew erupt into laughter that brought on fits of coughing from a few. The ship's creaking and groaning was the only thing that quieted them down. Henry Jennings eased himself portside and gazed off at lights on the distant shore. He was shortly joined by Thatch and Hornigold. "Looks like all the lanterns in the entire town of Nassau are lit tonight," said Hornigold. The two other men were silent for a moment. "The coastline looks strange. Different," Thatch said quietly. "I've never felt the Caribbean waters so cold before," Charlotte DeBerry said from behind them. Neither of the men turned around, eyes fixated on the lights. "Maybe the storm blew us to another port? St. Augustine, Tortuga?" suggested Jennings. "Too far," said Hornigold. "Aye, but that ain't Nassau," Thatch said. "Then where?" asked Jennings. The Queen Anne's Revenge groaned again and began to list even more, causing everyone to stumble toward starboard. "Caesar, do we have an intact skiff?" Thatch called out to his first mate. Caesar went aft to check on the condition of the two skiffs that were stored near the rear of the ship. The sounds of wood giving way could be heard as water continued to flood below decks. "She's definitely taking on water," Rackham said. "Observant, that one," Charlotte DeBerry quietly quipped to Mary Reed. "You have no idea," replied Mary with a shake of her head as she squeezed water from her long hair. Edward Thatch made his way to the stairwell leading back to the main hold, along with Bart Roberts and Sam Bellamy. "There's a fair amount of plunder below deck," he told them. "Let's see what we can carry." "The main hold is flooded," called Charlotte. Thatch looked down the ladder, seeing it was as she reported. "Damn it all," he said. "Captain, we have only one skiff. The storm must have taken the other," Black Caesar arrived to exclaim. "Right then, let's get it in the water," Thatch said, leading the motley band of pirates toward the stern. They arrived and began quickly untying the skiff and lowering it into the water. There was no longer the need for a ladder to reach the waterline, as the Queen Anne's Revenge had sunk low enough to have the sea lapping over the deck now. They piled into the small craft just as the ship's list grew greater and half the deck was swallowed by the bay. Bart Roberts and Charles Vane manned the oars and stroked toward the shore. Thatch stoically watched as the sea claimed the Queen Anne's Revenge. Hornigold sat next to him, watching the ship's forecastle disappear beneath the water. "She was a prize," Hornigold remarked. That she was. Thatch took a last look, then turned toward the lighted port. The extensive docks were crowded with ships of all sizes. Several large ships were anchored nearby. One such ship became more visible as they approached the harbor. This one held all the pirates' gaze in awestruck silence. Mary Reed took in a loud breath as its details began to become clear. The ship was of massive size. She estimated it to be almost 400 feet long and 50 feet wide. It towered out of the water like nothing she had ever seen before. Most notable was the inadequate number of sails attached to its 3 masts. A ship this size would need a dozen sails to move its hulking frame, she mused. She searched the sides and the deck and realized that it had no cannons or guns, no way to defend itself for such a trophy. A great wheel was placed midships, like a huge wheel taken from a giant's wagon. Next to the wheel stood a large black cylinder that was slowly leaking dark smoke from its opening that smelled of burning coal. "What the devil?" exclaimed Jennings. "What the devil indeed," replied Thatch. Roberts and Vane had ceased their rowing as they coasted slowly past the ship, its name now visible along the side of the hull, SS Great Republic. Vane stared, mouth agape, at the enormous vessel. They all silently inspected its details in amazement. "What is the wheel for?" asked Anne Bonny. "Moves the ship," Hornigold answered quietly. "What moves the wheel?" "Don't know," Hornigold answered after a few moments. As the pirates slowly glided upon the water, the rest of the ships anchored and moored in the harbor continued to astonish. There were many that were clearly made not of wood, but entirely of metal, with some completely devoid of sails whatsoever. The crew remained silent and awestruck as they reached a small beachfront that allowed them to pull the skiff up onto the shore. "Where the bloody hell are we?" asked Jennings, of no one in particular. They all walked up the bank to the dirt road that stretched along the beachfront. To the left were the docks lined with buildings that looked like storehouses and boatyards. There were strange, softly glowing lamps illuminating the buildings, roads and sidewalks that expanded into the main part of the large city. To the right, the buildings were sparser. Most resembled homes that became larger and more grand as they crept up the hillside. "I could use a drink to wash out the taste of the sea from my mouth," said Charlotte de Berry as she began walking toward the docks. One by one, the rest of the pirates followed her up the path. There were still men working at this hour of the night, moving boxes from ships to shore or in reverse. Groups of people could be seen walking through the streets and milling about. Horses and carriages trotted up and down the roads in the distance. The 11 pirates, in dripping clothes, marched toward the main street that ended at the docks. A small party of men standing on the street corner smoking and talking paused in their conversation as they noticed them approaching. One of the men nudged the man next to him, who then turned to take in the motley group. The men were dressed in pants, pointed boots, with buttoned shirts underneath vests and long overcoats. They wore a variety of hats that featured bowler to wide-brimmed styles. All the men sported mustaches of various lengths. They all watched in confoundment as the ornately dressed and overly armed pirates of the Caribbean Sea approached their little band. "Ain't this a fancy bunch?" one of the men said. "Maybe they's part of some entertainment playing in one of them theaters," suggested another. Thatch was the first to speak as they stopped in front of the men. "What town might this be?" The men looked at each other in confusion. "San Francisco." "Never heard of such a town. What island is this?" asked Bart Roberts. One of the men squinted his eyes at them and let out a chuckle. "Ain't no island? Y'all actors in a play or something?" "This part of the Americas?" asked Hornigold. "Yeah, San Francisco is part of the Americas," one of the men said with a laugh and an elbow to one of his mates. "How far is it to St. Augustine?" asked Jennings, referring to the popular Florida port of call. The men looked at one another before one of them piped up. Maybe 3,000 or so miles. Best get yourself some good sturdy horses, or maybe take the train if you're needin' to travel there." "Train?" inquired Anne Bonny. There was an awkward silence as the men tried to figure out if this was some sort of joke that was being played upon them. "Why are y'all dressed like that?" one of the bolder men finally asked. "You with the theater or something?" "No, blast your eyes, we're not," Jennings replied testily, fingering his nearest pistol. "And who might you be to presume such slander?" "Oh, we're nobody, sir," another of the men said hastily. "Don't mind us. We're just harmless cowboys, sir, passing through." "Where can we find a drink?" asked Charlotte. One of the men pointed up the street, and the pirates made their way along the lighted boulevard, leaving the befuddled group in their wake. "Ever heard of San Francisco?" Jennings asked Thatch. Thatch answered by shaking his head. He was too busy looking at the storefronts, wagons, horses, and uniquely dressed townsfolk. He hadn't seen so many people in one city since his days in Europe. Even Virginia paled in comparison to this. San Francisco. They, as well, were being noticed by the many people they passed. The stares were becoming uncomfortable. The uniqueness of the faces was intriguing as well. Thatch noticed there were more Chinese faces here than he had ever seen. There were also blacks, natives, South Americans, Irish, and more he didn't recognize. They were passing the front of a 3-story brick building with a waiting crowd out front when several bystanders pointed and motioned toward the pirates. The crowd was well dressed in suit coats, ties, and top hats for the men, and the women sported ornate gowns and dresses. 2 men were in the middle of the street with a black cloth draped behind a device standing on 3 legs. One of the men nudged the other and pointed at the pirates. Hornigold stopped, and the others paused with him to stare at the onlookers. "Hold, hold, hold," said one of the men, holding up a hand. The other man spun his device to face the pirate crew. Hornigold's and several other pirate hands found the hilts of their swords or pistols, but paused there as the man behind the device ducked his head under the black drape, and the other held a light on a pole that flashed brightly. Vane and Bart Roberts pulled their cutlasses at the blinding flash, but held their ground as the crowd laughed and cheered. The device men clapped and waved before gathering up the gear and moving into the building with a sign above displaying the name Wade's Opera House. The pirates looked at one another in confusion and continued their journey through the strange streets of San Francisco. "There," said Charlotte, nodding toward an ornate 2-story building with red curtains hanging behind the windows. Lively music was emerging from inside, and the sign mounted above the doorframe proclaiming the name of the establishment as the Paris. Charlotte marched up the steps to the entrance. She turned back toward the group. "Come on, then. Thatch, I think you owe a girl a drink after that voyage." Thatch arched his wide black brows. Charlotte opened the door, and piano music and rowdy laughter poured out from the opening. "That I do," Thatch said with a mischievous grin. With a wide motion of his hand, he held open the door for his band of Caribbean pirates to enter the late 1800s gambling hall sitting at the end of Sacramento Street in San Francisco, California. Chapter 2 stops there. The next chapter, we'll find out how much fun pirates can have in a saloon in 1873, and how much trouble they can get into as well. Don't steer away from liking and subscribing to this podcast. You can also leave comments. Those are really helpful to raise up the visibility of podcasts. You can join the Pirate Republic. It's a weekly newsletter that comes out every Friday at thepiraterepublic.com. Till then, I bid you farewell until we sail again, probably next week.